Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really intriguing question. Actually came to us from one of you listening.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's about this proposed first global biosecurity treaty at the WHO. But here's the fact that, well, it stopped me in my tracks.
Okay.
Apparently, this pandemic treaty is only the second legally binding agreement ever hammered out by the World Health Organization. Second.
Wow, only the second.
Right. So the immediate question that just pops up is, what on earth was the first one?
That's exactly right. And figuring out what that first one was and, how it worked gives us really crucial context for what's being discussed right now.
Makes sense.
And the listener who flagged this, they also pointed to several bits of the proposed treaty that are causing, well, a lot of discussion.
Like which parts?
Article 1 on definitions, Article 5, and this One Health idea, Article 12 about pathogen access, and particularly Article 19.
Article 19. What's that?
That sets up something called a Conference of the Parties, a COP, which, could potentially expand the treaty's power later on. Ah, okay. So even if the initial treaty is one thing, this COP could change it.
That's the concern being raised, yeah. We've seen commentary, like from the Brownstone Institute, pointing out that while the current wording might seem maybe less forceful.
Because of negotiations?
Exactly, because of negotiations, lots of using words like may instead of stronger terms. But this COP mechanism, it still makes people wonder about what future obligations could come.
Gotcha. So, okay, the mission for this deep dive seems pretty clear. We need to uncover that original legally binding agreement from the WHO.
Right.
What was it? How did it even happen? And maybe most importantly, what can it teach us about how this kind of global health governance, takes shape and actually influences things?
Yeah, let's trace that first step into binding global health rules.
So let's dive in. What was it?
Okay, the answer to your big question. The first legally binding international agreement negotiated under the WHO's guidance was the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Tobacco control, okay, wow. That actually triggers a really specific memory for me.
Oh,
yeah, Ireland. March 2004. I was living there then, and I vividly remember this announcement it felt almost unbelievable at the time of a nationwide smoking ban.
The workplace ban. Right.
Exactly. In all workplaces, pubs, restaurants, offices, everything. It felt totally revolutionary. And I'm sure a lot of people thought, this is way too much.
I bet. Big change for pub culture, especially.
Totally. But then, over the next few years, we started seeing similar bans just popping up everywhere, country after country. It was like a global switch just flipped on where you could smoke.
That's actually a perfect example of how it played out. What felt like a very national decision in Ireland in 2004 was definitely part of a much larger global trend. And you're right to sense there might have been some coordination behind it.
So it wasn't just Ireland deciding this on its own?
Well, the decision to implement the ban was Ireland's ultimately. But let's say the international groundwork, the foundation for policies like that on a global scale, that was being laid by the WHO.
Okay, right. So how did the WHO actually do that then? Did they have some kind of power to force countries into it?
Not quite like forcing. No, not a direct enforcement stick. The key is actually in the WHO's own constitution, specifically Article 19.
Article 19. Okay, what does that do?
It basically gives the World Health Assembly, that's the WHO's main governing body, where all the member states meet.
Got it.
It gives them the authority to adopt conventions or agreements on really any health matter that WHO deals with.
And how do they adopt them?
Needs a 2/3 majority vote. Or sometimes they just reach a consensus. But here's the really crucial bit.
Yeah.
Once a convention like that is adopted by the Assembly, it becomes legally binding for each member state that decides to ratify it, according to their own laws back home.
Ah, okay. So the WHO adopts it, but then each country has to actively sign on.
Exactly. They have to take that step themselves. And importantly, this very same Article 19, that's the legal basis they're using for the pandemic treaty negotiations happening now.
Okay, so back to the Tobacco Control Treaty. I mean, on the surface, it sounds kind of hard to argue against, doesn't it? Like, who's going to stand up and say they're for secondhand smoke exposure?
Precisely. And that was the framing. The official goals of the Framework Convention, which was adopted back in 2003.
2003, okay.
They were focused on things like protection from exposure to tobacco smoke and reduction measures concerning tobacco dependence and cessation.
Yeah.
Helping people quit.
Right. Standard public health stuff, really.
From a public health perspective, absolutely.
Yeah.
Widely seen as positive goals. Now, sure, there are always arguments about, individual liberty versus government rules.
Like the source we mentioned earlier might bring up.
Exactly. Our source definitely touches on that libertarian perspective. But those kinds of objections often find it hard to get wide public traction when the issue is framed purely around health risks.
And then came the ripple effect. Ireland in 2004, like I mentioned.
Yep, a key early adopter.
And then just more and more countries putting similar bans in place. So it wasn't just a coincidence, like everyone had the same idea at once. This WHO framework was sort of the blueprint.
That's a good way to put it. A blueprint, a template, and maybe even some international keeping up with the Joneses pressure.
Normative pressure, maybe.
Yeah, normative pressure is a good term. The WHO provided that internationally agreed upon framework. It gave countries the legal foundation if they wanted to act. And it built this global consensus that tobacco is harmful and needs controlling. It really encouraged and, made it easier for countries to make those policy changes nationally.
It's a pretty clear demonstration, then, of how an international body using these health agreements can really shape national laws. And even, everyday public behavior all over the world.
It is. A powerful example.
Which, brings us back to that more critical take from our source material.
Right.
They argue that this whole global shift on smoking bans was, and this is their phrase, the very thin edge of the very large wedge of global biosecurity tyranny.
That's a very strong way to put it.
It is. They even use an analogy comparing it to how, say, censorship might start by targeting something everyone agrees is bad before, expanding its reach.
It's a viewpoint that definitely raises big questions about, let's call it mission creep, or the potential for gradual expansion of international health powers.
And do they have any recent examples to back that kind of concern?
Well, to illustrate that point about long-term consequences, the source points to something happening right now, or very recently, in Newton, Massachusetts.
Okay, what happened there?
In January 2025, an ordinance passed that will permanently ban anyone born after March 1st, 2004 from ever buying tobacco products there. A lifetime ban based on birth date.
Wow. Born after March 1st, 2004. That's oddly specific. That's right around the time of the Ireland ban, I remember.
Exactly the connection the source implies. They pose the question, is this local Massachusetts rule somehow, a long-term ripple effect from the precedent set way back by Ireland's 2004 ban, which itself followed the WHO framework?
It certainly paints a picture of how things could unfold over decades. A kind of slow, generational tightening of rules.
It definitely highlights that vision, yes. A vision of increasingly restrictive measures playing out over a long timeline.
Which makes you think again about the current pandemic treaty discussions. Our source mentions it still has hurdles to clear, right? Bureaucratic steps.
Oh, yeah. It's not a done deal. It still needs that 2/3 vote in the World Health Assembly, or potentially a consensus agreement.
And there's a time lag, too.
Right. They mentioned this 18-month window after adoption where member states have to formally notify the WHO about whether they're signing on or opting out, essentially. It's a process.
It sounds like a very deliberate, step-by-step kind of approach. Takes time.
And that's a key observation from the source's perspective. The argument is that these long procedural pathways, that's exactly where those pushing for more global governance tend to thrive.
Because they can play the long game.
Exactly. The idea is they can afford to be patient. They can wait for the right moment. Maybe the next health scare, bird flu, monkeypox pops up again, or that hypothetical disease X.
Right. Wait for a crisis to push things forward.
That's the concern raised. That even if there are setbacks now, like maybe the current draft isn't as strong as some wanted, the underlying goal, the push towards what they call the more centralized global biosecurity state, well, that drive remains dangerous.
So, okay, let's try and wrap this up. The big takeaway here, the connection between past and present. It seems to be that the WHO's first binding treaty, the one on tobacco control, it gives us a real-world blueprint. A tangible example of how global health governance can actually be established, and then how it can potentially expand over time, often, through these seemingly small steps, all under that banner of public health.
That sums it up perfectly. And for you, the listener, wanting to stay informed on this stuff, understanding this history, this precedent with tobacco, it's really crucial.
How's that?
Because it shows the mechanisms. It demonstrates how these international agreements can actually filter down and lead to pretty big changes in national laws and even just how we all behave.
Right.
Looking at tobacco control now, which is mostly widely accepted.
Yeah, it seems normal now.
Exactly. It gives us a framework, a lens for thinking about the current pandemic treaty talks and what the long-term effects could be.
Right. It helps you evaluate what's happening now by looking at what happened before.
Precisely.
Which leaves us with, I guess, a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If they could build this global consensus around something like tobacco control, what other areas, what other aspects of health, or maybe even things beyond health, societal well-being, whatever, what else might be open to similar kinds of international agreements down the road?
And what would that mean?
Yeah, what are the implications for, individual freedom, for national sovereignty? It's definitely something worth keeping in the back of your mind as these global discussions keep going. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.